Continuing Antenna from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. But so wholly was he now the mere appendage to the person of Cleopatra that, although he was much superior to the enemy in land forces, yet, out of complaisance to his mistress, he wished the victory to be gained by sea, and that too when he could not but see how, for the want of sailors, his captains, all through unhappy Greece, were pressing every description of men, common travellers and donkey drivers, harvest laborers and boys, and for all this the vessels had not their complements, but remained, most of them, ill-manned and badly rowed. Casar, on the other side, had ships, but light, swift, and perfectly manned, and from his headquarters at Tarentum Brundusium he sent messages to Antenna, not to protract the war, but come out with his forces. He would give him secure roadsteads and ports for his fleet, and for his land army to disembark and pitch their camp. He would leave him as much ground in Italy, inland from the sea, as a horse could traverse in a single course. Antenna, on the other side, with the like bold language, challenged him to a single combat, though he were much older, and that being refused, proposed to meet him in the Pharsalian fields, where Casar and Pompey had fought before. But whilst Antenna lay with his fleet near Actium, where now stands Nicopolis, Casar seized his opportunity and crossed the Ionian Sea, securing himself at a place in Epirus called Ladla. And when those about Antenna were much disturbed, their land forces being a good way off, indeed, said Cleopatra in mockery, we may well be frightened if Casar has got hold of the ladle on the morrow. Antenna seized the enemy, sailing up, and fearing lest his ships might be taken for want of the soldiers, to go on board of them, armed with all rowers, and made a show upon the decks of being in readiness to fight. The oars were mounted as if waiting to be put in motion, and the vessels themselves drawn up to face the enemy on either side of the channel of Actium, as though they were properly manned and ready for an engagement, and Casar, deceived by this stratagem, retired. He was also thought to have shown considerable skill in cutting off the water from the enemy by some lines of trenches and forts, water not being plentiful anywhere else, nor very good. And again, his conduct to Domitius was generous, much against the will of Cleopatra, for when he had made his escape in a little boat, Casar, having then a fever upon him, although Antenna could not but resent it highly, yet he sent after him his whole equipage with his friends and servants, and Domitius, as if he would give a testimony to the world how repentant he had become on his desertion and treachery, being thus manifest, died soon after. Among the kings also Amantus and Diotarus went over to Casar, and the fleet was so unfortunate in everything that it was undertaken, and so unready on every occasion, that Antenna was driven again to put his confidence in the land forces. Candius, too, who commanded the legions, when he saw how things stood, changed his opinion, and now was of advice that Cleopatra should be sent back, and that retiring unto Tharca or Macedonia, the quarrel should be decided in a land fight. For Decones, also the king of the Getae, promised to come and join him with a great army, and it would not be any kind of disparagement to him to yield the sea to Caesar, who in the Sicilian wars had such a long practice in ship fighting. On the contrary, it would seem ridiculous for Antony, who was by land the most experienced commander living, to make no use of his well-disciplined and numerous infantry, scattering and wasting his forces by parceling them out on ships. Parceling them out in the ships. But for all this, Cleopatra prevailed that a sea fight should determine all, having already an eye to flight, and ordering all her affairs, not so as to assist in gaining a victory, but to escape with the greatest safety from the commencement of a defeat. But there were two long walls extending from the camp to the station of the ships, between which Antony used to pass to and fro without suspecting any danger. But Caesar, upon the suggestion of a servant that it would not be difficult to surprise him, laid an ambush, which, rising up somewhat too hastily, seized the man that came just before him, he himself escaping narrowly by flight. When it was resolved to stand to a fight at sea, they set fire to all the Egyptian ships except 60, and of these, the best and largest, from 10 banks down to 3, he manned with 20,000 full-armed men and 2,000 archers. Here it is related that the foot captain, one that had fought often under Antony, and had his body all mangled with wounds, exclaimed, "O my general, what have our wounds and swords done to displease you, that you should give your confidence to rotten timbers? Let Egyptians and Phoenicians contend at sea. Give us land where we know well how to die upon the spot, or gain the victory." To which he answered nothing, but by his look and motion of his hand, seeming to bid him be of good courage, passed forwards, having already, it would seem, no very sure hopes, since when the masters proposed leaving the sails behind them, he commanded that they should be put aboard. "For we must not," said he, let one enemy escape." That day and the 3 following, the sea was so rough that they could not engage, but on the 5th there was a calm, and they fought, Antony commanding with Pabricala the right, and Coelius the left squadron, Marcus Octavius and Marcus Instius the center. Caesar gave the charge of the left to Agrippa, commanding in person on the right. And as for the land forces, Canidius was general for Antony, Taurus, Caesar, both armies remaining drawn up in order along the shore. And notice a lot of these grimoires and the old spiritual texts use some of these army divisions and definitions as a metaphor for the hereafter, for what these certain beings do. And Antony in a small boat went from one ship to another, encouraging his soldiers and bidding them stand firm and fight as steadily on their large ships as if they were on land. The masters he ordered that they should receive the enemy lying still as if they were at anchor, and maintain the entrance of the port, which was a narrow and difficult passage. Of Caesar, they relate that leaving his tent and going round, while it was yet dark, to visit the ships. He met a man driving a donkey, and asked him his name. He answered him that his own name was Fortunate, and my donkey, says he, is called Conqueror. And afterwards, when he disposed the beaks of the ships in that place, in token of his victory, the statue of this man and his donkey in bronze were placed amongst them. After examining the rest of his fleet, he went in a boat to the right wing and looked with much admiration at the enemy, lying perfectly still in the straits, in all appearance as if they had been at anchor. For some considerable length of time he actually thought they were so, and kept his own ships at rest, at a distance of about 8 furlongs from them. But about noon a breeze sprang up from the sea, and Antena's men, weary of expecting the enemy so long, and trusting to their large tall vessels as if they had been invincible, began to advance. The left squadron, Kaiser was overjoyed to see them more, and ordered his own right squadron to retire, that he might entice them out to sea as far as he could, his design being to sail round and round, and so with his light and well-manned galleys to attack these huge vessels, which their size and their want of men made slow to move and difficult to manage. When they engaged, there was no charging or striking of one ship by another, because Antenas, by reason of their great bulk, were incapable of the rapidity required to make the stroke effectual. And on the other side, Kaiser's durst not charge head to head on Antenas, which were all armed with solid masses and spikes of brass, nor did they like even to run in on their sides, which were so strongly built with great squared pieces of timber, fastened together with iron bolts, so that their vessels' beaks would easily have been shattered upon them, so that the engagement resembled a land fight, or so to speak, yet more properly the attack and defense of a fortified place, for there were always 3 or 4 vessels of Kaiser's about one of Antenas, pressing them with spears, javelins, poles, and several inventions of fire, which they flung among them. Antena's men, using catapults, also to pour down missiles from wooden towers. Agrippa drawing out the squadron under his command to outflank the enemy. Publicola was obliged to observe his motions, and gradually to break off from the middle squadron, where some confusion and alarm ensued, while Aruntius engaged them. But the fortune of the day was still undecided, and the battle equal, when on a sudden Cleopatra's 60 ships were seen hoisting sail and making out to sea in full flight, right through the ships that were engaged, for they were placed behind the great ships, which, in breaking through, they put into disorder. The enemy was astonished to see them sailing off with a fair wind towards Peloponnesus. Here it was that Antony showed to all the world that he was no longer actuated by the thoughts and motives of a commander or a man, or indeed by his own judgment at all. And what was once said as a jest, that the soul of a lover lies in someone else's body, he proved to be a serious truth, for as if he had been born part of her, and must move with her wheresoever she went. As soon as he saw her ship sailing away, he abandoned all that were fighting and spending their lives for him, and put himself aboard a galley of 5 banks of oars, taking with him only Alexander of Syria and Schelias to follow her that had so well begun his ruin, and would hereafter accomplish it. She, perceiving him to follow, gave the signal to come aboard. So as soon as he came up with them, he was taken into the ship, but without seeing her or letting himself be seen by her, he went forward by himself and sat alone without a word in the ship's prow, covering his face with his 2 hands. In the meanwhile, some of Chasar's light Liburnian ships that were in pursuit came in sight, but on Antena's commanding to face about, they all gave back except Eurycles, the Iconian, who pressed on, shaking a lance from the deck, as if he meant to hurl it at him. Antona, standing at the prow, demanded of him, "Who is this that pursues Antona?" "I'm he," said he, "Eurycles, the son of Lachares, armed with Chasar's fortune to revenge my father's death." Lachares had been much condemned for a robbery and beheaded by Antena's orders. However, Eurycles did not attack Antona, but ran with his full force upon the other admiral galley, for there were 2 of them, and with the blow turned her round, and took both her and another ship, in which was a quantity of rich plate and furniture. So as soon as Eurycles was gone, Antona returned to his posture and sat silent, and thus he remained for 3 days, either in anger with Cleopatra, or wishing not to upbraid her, at the end of which they touched at Taenarus. Here the women of their company succeeded first in bringing them to speak, and afterwards to eat and sleep together. And by this time several of the ships of burden and some of his friends began to come in to him from the rout, bringing news of his fleet being quite destroyed, but that the land forces, they thought, still stood firm, so that he sent messengers to Canidius to march the army with all speed through Macedonian into Asia, and designing himself to go from Taenarus into Africa, he gave one of the merchant ships, laden with a large sum of money and vessels of silver and gold of great value, belonging to the royal collections, to his friends, desiring them to share it amongst them and provide for their own safety. They, refusing his kindness with tears in their eyes, he comforted them with all goodness and humanity imaginable, entreating them to leave them, and wrote letters in their behalf to Theophilus, his steward at Corinth, that he would provide for their security and keep them concealed till such time as they could make their peace with Chasar. This Theophilus was the father of Hipparchus, who had such interest with Antona. It was the first of all his freedmen that went over to Chasar, and who settled afterwards at Corinth. In this posture were affairs with Antona, but at Actium his fleet, after long resistance to Chasar, and suffering the most damage from a heavy sea that set in right ahead, scarcely at 4 in the afternoon. They didn't have daylight savings time, and they meant like something like 2/3 of the afternoon, because they divide day and night into 12 sections each. but they knew the days were longer or shorter, but you know what I mean, so approximately like that. Gave up the contest with a loss of not more than 5,000 killed, but of 300 ships taken, as Chasar himself has recorded. Only a few had known of Antinous' flight, and those that were told of it could not at first give any belief to so incredible a thing as that a general who had 19 entire legions and 12,000 horse upon the seashore could abandon all and fly away, and he above all, who had so often experienced both good and evil fortune, and had in 1,000 wars and battles been inured to changes. His soldiers, however, would not give up their desires and expectations, still fancying he would appear from some part or other, and showed such a generous fidelity to his service that, when they were thoroughly assured that he was fled in earnest, they kept themselves in a body 7 days, making no account of the messages that Chasar sent to them. But at last, seeing that Canidius himself, who commanded them, was fled from the camp by night, and that all their officers had quite abandoned them, they gave way and made their submission to the conqueror. After this, Chasar set sail for Athens, where he made a settlement with Greece, and disturbed what remained of the provision of corn, grain, barley, spelt, something like that. Maybe, they're in contact with Egypt, so maybe there was wheat too. That Antony had made for his army among the cities, which were in a miserable condition, despoiled of their money, their slaves, their horses, and beasts of service. My great-grandfather, Nicarchus, used to relate that the whole body of the people of our city were put in requisition to carry each one a certain measure of corn upon their shoulders to the seaside near Anticara, men standing by to quicken them with the lash. They had made one journey of the kind, but when they had just measured out the corn, they were putting it on their backs for a second. News came out of Antinous' defeat, and so saved Chaeronea, for all Antinous' purveyors and soldiers fled upon the news, and left them to divide the corn among themselves. When Antony came into Africa, he sent on Cleopatra from the Paratonium into Egypt, and stayed himself in the most entire solitude that he could desire, roaming and wandering about with only 2 friends, one a Greek, Aristocratus, a rhetorician, and the other a Roman, Lacilius, of who we have elsewhere spoken, how at Philippi, to give Brutus time to escape, he suffered himself to be taken by the pursuers, pretending he was Brutus. Antony gave him his life, and on this account he remained true and faithful to him to the last. But when also the officer who commanded for him in Africa, to whose care he had committed all his forces there, took them over to Chasar, he resolved to kill himself, but was hindered by his friends, and coming to Alexandria, he found Cleopatra busied in a most bold and wonderful enterprise over the small space of land which divides the Red Sea from the sea near Egypt, which may be considered also the boundary between Asia and Africa, and in the narrowest place is not much above 300 furlongs across. Over this neck of land, Cleopatra had formed a project of dragging her fleet and settling it afloat in the Arabian Gulf, thus, with her soldiers and her treasure, to secure herself a home on the other side, where she might live in peace, far away from the war and slavery. But the first galleys, which were carried over, being burnt by the Arabians of Petra, and Antenna, not knowing but that the army before Actium still held together, she desisted from her enterprise and gave orders for the fortifying all the approaches to Egypt. But Antenna, leaving the city and the conversation of his friends, built them a dwelling place in the water, near Pharos, upon a little mole which he cast up in the sea, and there, secluding himself from the company of mankind, said he desired nothing but to live the life of a Timon, as indeed in his case was the same, and the ingratitude and injuries which he suffered from all those he had esteemed his friends made him hate and distrust all mankind. Well, higher station, of course, is to hate some of the deeds and stuff like that, but not humanity as a whole. But this Timon was a citizen of Athens and lived much about the Peloponnesian War, as may be said by the comedies of Aristophanes, Plato, in which he is ridiculed as hater and enemy of mankind. He avoided and repelled the approaches of every one, but embraced with kisses and the greatest show of affection Alcibiades, then in his hot youth. And when Epaminondas was astonished and demanded the reason, he replied that he knew this young man would one day do infinite mischief to the Athenians. He never admitted anyone into his company, except at times this Epaminondas, who was of the same sort of temper, and was an imitator of his way of life. At the celebration of the festival of the flagons, these two kept the feast together, and Epaminondas saying to him, "What a pleasant party, Timon, it would be," he answered, "if you were away." One day he got up in a full assembly on the speaker's place, and when there was a dead silence and great wonder at so unusual a sight, he said, "Ye men of Athens, I have a little plot of ground, and in it grows a fig tree on which many citizens have been pleased to hang themselves. And now, having resolved to build in that place, I wish to announce it publicly, that any of you who may be desirous may go and hang yourselves before I cut it down." Okay, I was wondering where the suicide thing was going to come in this chapter. Yeah, don't make it's like, I'm quite the opposite. I'm like, if I can't trust people around the mushrooms, I'm like, I'm not inviting you over, thank you very much. He died and was buried at Hala, near the sea, where it so happened that after his burial, a landslip took place on the point of the shore, and the sea flowing in surrounding his tomb made it inaccessible to the foot of man. It bore this inscription: "Here am I laid, my life of misery done. Ask not my name, I curse you every one." That's something to put on your tomb, isn't it? No, it's not. But yeah, I never find cool inscriptions like that And this epitaph was made by himself when he had alive, which is more generally known by Callimachus. "Timon the misanthrope, am I below? Go and revile me, traveller, only go." This much of Timon, of whom much more might be said. Canidius now came, bringing word in person of the loss of the army before Actium, Then he received news that Herod of Judea was gone over to Chasar with some legions and cohorts, and that the other kings and princes were in like manner deserting him, and that out of Egypt nothing stood by him. All this, however, seemed not to disturb him, but as if he were glad to put away all hope, that with it he might be rid of all care, and leaving his habitation by the sea, which he called Timonium, he was received by Cleopatra in the palace, and set the whole city into a course of feasting, drinking, and presents. The son of Chasar and Cleopatra was registered among the youths, and Antyllus, his own son by Fulvia, received the gown without the purple border given to those that were come of age, in honor of which the citizens of Alexandria did nothing but feast and revel for many days. They themselves broke up the order of the inimitable livers. Not the organ, but being alive, right? And constituted another in its place, not inferior in splendor, luxury, and sumptuosity, calling it that of the debtors together. For all those that said they would die with Antenna and Cleopatra gave in their names for the present, passing their time in all manner of pleasures and a regular succession of banquets. But Cleopatra was busied in making a collection of all the varieties of poisonous drugs, and in order to see which of them were the least painful in the operation, she had them tried upon prisoners condemned to die, but finding that the quick poisons always worked with sharp pains, and that the less painful were slow, she next tried venomous animals, and watching with her own eyes whilst they were applied, one creature to the body of another, this was her daily practice, and she pretty well satisfied herself. She satisfied herself that nothing was comparable to the bite of the asp, which, without convulsion or groaning, brought on a heavy drowsiness and lethargy. Well, I knew this part was coming though, but with a gentle sweat on the face, the senses being stupefied by degrees, the patient, in appearance, being sensible of no pain, but rather troubled to be disturbed or awakened, like those that are in a profound natural